Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as we look at what the North chose to do with the defeated South after the Civil War. Because the surrender of the Confederate armies in April of 1865 was a great victory for the North, was overshadowed by the great national tragedy of the death of Abraham Lincoln. A tragedy for the North, of course, but a tragedy it would turn out too for the South. John Wilkes Booth was considered the most handsome man in America, and he was an actor, and the son of an actor, John Brutus Booth, brother of Edwin Booth, considered by many of his contemporaries the best actor of his day. The Booth family was originally from England, but John Wilkes Booth was born and raised in Maryland and lived in Richmond and Washington immediately before and during the war. And although he hated black people and hated the North for the destruction and humiliation faced by the South, he apparently didn't hate the North enough to, actually join the Confederate Army and fight back against it. Instead, he devised a scheme to kidnap Lincoln, whom he blamed above all others, and exchange him for Confederate prisoners held in the North. This plan never amounted to anything, but later he and a number of other conspirators, including some involved in the first conspiracy, hatched a plot to kill Lincoln, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, and commanding general of the U.S. Armies, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, on April 14, 1865, the United States celebrated the anniversary of the fall of Fort Sumter. Robert Anderson, the former commander of Fort Sumter, went to the fort and raised the flag he had been forced to haul down 4 years before. In the evening, Lincoln went to the theater, to Ford's Theater, to attend a popular comedy, Our American Cousin. Booth got his mail at the theater and knew Lincoln would be there. Ulysses S. Grant was also supposed to be there, but Mrs. Grant disliked Mrs. Lincoln, and they made up a flimsy excuse to be out of town. So another officer and his girlfriend were at the play instead. During Act 3, Scene 2 of Our American Cousin, the funniest line in the play was guaranteed to get a laugh. And, hoping to use this to cover the sound of his gunshot, John Wilkes Booth sneaked into the president's box and fired his derringer into the back of his head. The president collapsed immediately. Booth leaped to the stage, catching his spur in the bunting and breaking his leg. On stage, Booth shouted Sic Semper Tyrannis, Latin for thus always to tyrants, a phrase supposedly coined by the original Brutus when he assassinated Julius Caesar, and the state motto of Virginia since the days of the American Revolution. And from there, Booth limped out to try to go on the run. Doctors tried to help Lincoln, but probably made things worse, although I doubt even modern medical care could have saved him. He did survive through the night, but comatose, and died the next morning at 7:22 a.m. Secretary of War Stanton said now he belongs to the ages. The man assigned to kill William Henry Seward tried and failed. Seward had suffered a bad fall not long before and was wearing a neck brace with large metal parts that protected much of his face and neck. So the man who tried to cut his throat, although he badly cut up his face and hands, was not actually able to murder Seward. Although he suffered sufficient blood loss, they thought he might die from his injuries, and one side of his face was so badly scarred that for the rest of his life, when he had photographs made, he had them made from the side to hide the scarred side of his face. The man assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson changed his mind at the last minute and never attacked him at all. And so Andrew Johnson became president in his own right, but did not have a great reputation. He had gone to his own inauguration as vice president drunk. One story has it that the outgoing vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, deliberately offered him too much to drink the night before, possibly on top of a bad cold. Lincoln was apparently embarrassed and disgusted by this show, and only spoke to him once after that. Still, there's much to admire in Andrew Johnson. It's likely no one ever rose from humbler beginnings to become president than Andrew Johnson, although some would say that it showed. His parents were poor farmers in North Carolina who had apprenticed him to a tailor. He didn't like his apprenticeship and ran off fleeing to Tennessee, where, never attending school, he eventually taught himself to read, and his wife taught him math in his early 20s, as he worked as a tailor in Greenville. He became a successful businessman, served as an alderman and mayor in Greenville, and later governor of Tennessee, congressman, and senator. He was appointed military governor of Tennessee for much of the Civil War, and then as the most prominent loyal Southern Democrat as Lincoln's vice presidential candidate for the Union Party in 1864. And he was famous for supporting the interests of poor whites against big slave owners. However, like John Tyler, another Southerner who stood by his principles even when inconvenient, and who was chosen to balance a ticket between two factions, Johnson would not turn out to be a successful leader. He may not have liked the rich whites who dominated the South before the war, but he also didn't like Northerners. He also didn't like blacks. And as a Democrat, he was not popular with the Republican-dominated Congress, nor did he particularly like them. And as a Unionist Southerner from a poor background, the upper class of the South disliked him too. He was committed to the Constitution as he understood it, and was buried with a copy of the Constitution for his pillow, but he couldn't get along with anyone. As president, he would have many enemies, few friends, and a lot of trouble. Although at first he had a great deal of support as people rallied around him and the government as a whole to hunt down John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices, which would be the first major task of Johnson's presidency, although it was largely supervised by the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton. Booth himself was killed while they attempted to capture him. But 4 of his accomplices, 3 men and 1 woman, Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government, were hanged. 4 others were imprisoned, most famously Samuel Mudd, the doctor who had treated Booth's broken leg after he fled the scene. And while in prison as a doctor, he was able to help defeat a yellow fever epidemic that broke out in the prison off the coast of Florida where he was being housed, becoming a minor hero to his fellow prisoners. The war, of course, had left the South devastated, but the North relatively untouched, although deeply bitter over the loss of lives, in particular that of Abraham Lincoln. Half the Southern capitals had been captured or destroyed, along with many other cities. Most of the South's few factories, the South's banking cotton gins and banking system, and large sections of her railroads. Before the war, 5 railroads converged on Columbia, South Carolina. After the war, the nearest railroad was 20 miles away. And of course, $2 billion worth of slaves had been lost to the South. A vast investment vanished along with the investment and other improvements to the plantations, and all the money lost in worthless Confederate paper money and bonds. Livestock had been stolen or destroyed, crops burned to the ground. Yet many Southerners still felt the lost cause had been a just one. They might belong to the Union again, but they didn't have to like it. Of course, the freedmen, as the newly freed slaves were known, did not just represent a huge financial loss to the South or the disruption of a social system dating to the foundation of most Southern states. It also meant a loss of labor for planters who suddenly had no one to plant or harvest their crops. Furthermore, there was now an immense number of former slaves with no clear idea what to do next, although they were eager to find out. Many went traveling, which had been illegal under the days of slavery. They went to look for lost family members or to look for work. Some tried to go up north, hoping they would face less discrimination there. Some went out west, hoping for better opportunities. In particular, many went to Kansas, where large organized groups known as Exodusters, named after the Exodus in the Bible, moved to Kansas and set up their own communities. One of the leaders of the Exodusters being Pap Singleton, a former slave from Tennessee. Others just wanted to see the world after a lifetime in which they could not legally travel. Some remained with their former masters, whom they had known their entire lives, Others moved not far away to work on a different plantation, to do something they were used to, but still under different circumstances. Now, those that could bought fancy clothes. Many formalized the marriages that had had no legal force beforehand. They created their own churches with black ministers, built schools for themselves and for their children. Things difficult and often illegal to do in the late antebellum period. But because of all the disadvantages before the war, most blacks were uneducated, indeed illiterate, unskilled in most tasks, very poor, and in some ways unprepared for freedom. Now, even before the war came to a close, both Lincoln and Congress had been trying to figure out what to do with the South and Southerners, both black and white. One of their first effective creations was the Freedmen's Bureau, formed on March 3rd, 1865, and meant to help freed blacks, and in some cases poor Southern whites too, on their way to becoming productive citizens. In some ways it was a welfare agency, offering food, medical care, legal advice, education to freedmen, and again to white refugees who'd lost their homes too. Later on, the Freedmen's Bureau would help black people to vote when they got that right. The head of the Bureau was General Oliver Otis Howard, who had fought at Manassas on the peninsula where his right arm was shot off, at Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, and in Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Later, he would fight Indians out west. He would also go on to found Howard University in Washington, D.C., one of the oldest and most famous historically black universities, and also to found Lincoln Memorial University in East Tennessee as a reward for the poor mountain whites who had stayed loyal to the Union. The Freedmen's Bureau offered education, which was gladly accepted by freedmen of all ages. During his march to the sea, General Sherman had in some cases given tracts of 40 acres and a surplus army mules to freed slaves during his march, all as much as anything else to give them some place to stay so they would stop following his army around. And the idea of 40 acres and a mule came to symbolize the federal government's willingness to help former slaves and even redistribute the private property of former slave owners. Some radical members of Congress wanted to expand this offer to more freedmen, passed a 40 acres and a mule law, but it was rarely implemented and later completely defeated by President Johnson, who rescinded the few land grants that were ever made under it. And in some cases, the Freedmen's Bureau was corrupt. It did often use black votes to stuff the ballot boxes of Republican candidates in the South. In a few cases, corrupt Freedmen's Bureau agents even coerced or tricked black people into signing labor contracts that nearly made them slaves of the local whites. But for the most part, the Bureau did very good work, at least when it was able to do so. It was limited, though, by opposition in the South and apathy in the North, especially as the war receded further and further into the past. Now, as early as 1863, President Lincoln had devised a plan for bringing the Southern states back into the Union. He claimed that because secession was illegal, the Southern states had never actually seceded, and therefore returning to statehood was pretty easy because they'd never actually ceased to be states. Under his plan, known as the 10% plan, 10% of registered voters in each Southern state would have to swear loyalty to the Union. Once they had done so, they could elect a new state government, and once Lincoln accepted that new state government, that state would function as an equal state in the Union again. Furthermore, Lincoln promised to use his presidential pardon to pardon any Confederate who would swear an oath of allegiance to the Union and accept the federal policy on slavery. Although he would deny pardons to any Confederate military or government officials who had killed black prisoners of war. But in theory, any white Southerner who had fought for the South was guilty of treason, making war against the United States, but Lincoln was prepared to pardon many of them to bring them back into the Union. Radical Republicans in Congress felt this was much too soft on the South and refused to seat elected representatives when they arrived in Washington from Louisiana, Arkansas, or Tennessee, after those states elected members of Congress under Lincoln's 10% plan in 1864. Radical Republicans instead created the Wade-Davis Bill and passed it in 1864. And many radicals felt that these southern states, by leaving the Union, had ceased to be states, no longer had equal rights, and deserved to be treated as conquered provinces that might one day begin the process of admission all over again. And radical Republicans believed the South needed a complete reconstruction of its society. Among other restrictions, much tougher ones, the Wade-Davis Bill required 50% of ex-Confederate men to take an oath of allegiance and swear they had never borne arms against the United States. After all, that would have made them traitors. It would have contained much stronger protections for emancipation than Lincoln's 10% plan did too. A much harsher form of Reconstruction, indeed one that might have required a couple generations for the South to again become full states, as some time would be needed to pass for enough adult men to be around who could swear they had never fought against the U.S. Having passed that bill, Congress went home, and Lincoln then refused to sign it. A law passed by Congress, of course, must be signed into law by the President or returned to Congress with his objections in the form of a veto. If the President refuses to do either one, it still becomes a law if Congress is in session. But if Congress is not in session and the President does not sign a law and cannot return it to Congress with his objections because they're out of town, then it ceases to go into effect, or fails to go into effect, what's known as the pocket veto. So Lincoln blocked the Wade-Davis bill with the pocket veto, not vetoing it outright, but by refusing to sign it, keeping it from going into effect. So by the time of Lincoln's death, nothing was resolved. There was no official plan for Reconstruction, and Lincoln, though, was known to favor a mild plan for reunification, saying in his second inaugural address, he won malice towards none, charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, and to welcome Southerners back into the Union as brothers who had gone astray. Indeed, when Lincoln died, there were some radicals in Congress who were secretly a little bit happy, feeling that President Johnson would be much more willing to punish the South than Lincoln had been. So Lincoln's assassination seemed to some an opportunity, Johnson being well known to hate the Southern upper class. But while Johnson certainly did hate the Southern upper class, he was still a Southerner and didn't want to see his fellow Southerners suffer unduly as he saw it. And so Johnson and Congress would end up fighting over their plans for Reconstruction for his entire presidency. Lincoln might have had the prestige and the political skills to maintain his plan or some relatively mild plan for Reconstruction in the face of opposition from Congress, but his death ensured the transition from war to peace would not go smoothly. It's possible Lincoln could not have managed Reconstruction well either, but there's no question that Johnson handled Congress and Reconstruction poorly. And as shortly after Congress went home, Andrew Johnson issued his own plan for Reconstruction, known as Presidential Reconstruction. It was based on Lincoln's 10% plan, although not quite identical to it. It did disenfranchise especially rich Confederates, those worth over $20,000, in probably equivalent to about $2 million today, as well as a few other prominent but less wealthy Confederate leaders, although they could appeal for presidential pardons personally, mostly so Johnson could gloat over their humiliation as they came begging to him. Southern states would have to call special state conventions to repeal their ordinances of secession and repudiate all Confederate debts, After all, if secession was illegal, they had no business paying back the debts they'd undertaken while at war. Plus, that would also clear off a lot of debts for Southern states who couldn't afford it, both freeing up the states and also punishing anyone who'd lent the states money during the war. Although it might mean the South could not pay pensions to Confederate war veterans. Finally, Southern states would have to ratify the 13th Amendment, bringing an end to slavery. But states that did all this, that swore loyalty and ended slavery, could return to the Union and become in fully equal states. And Johnson saw them as being fellow states that again had just not been behaving for a few years. Radical Republicans did not approve, but Johnson had waited till Congress was not in session before announcing his plans, and there wasn't much they could do. In the days before air conditioning and easy communication, Congress spent as much time on vacation as they could. And so by the end of 1865, 4 Southern states had rejoined the Union under Johnson's terms: Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Virginia, all having ratified the 13th Amendment. Some Southern states did refuse to ratify it, Mississippi as late as the 1990s, but enough states ratified it that it did become part of the Constitution in December of 1865, abolishing slavery across the United States. But as these Southern states returned to the Union, they found their own ways to deal with the freedmen. All the Southern states created laws to limit the rights and opportunities of black people. These new black codes were typically the old slave codes simply renamed. They varied from state to state, indeed from county to county, and varied over time, being less or more severe at different points, and again in different places, but they had the same goals, to control the black population, both from a social standpoint and above all, to provide a stable workforce for the South. In many places, in order to work, black people had to sign labor contracts, obliging them to work for a set period of time, typically 1 year, for one master. Usually they were only paid at the end of their term, so they didn't dare leave or do anything to get them fired. They could have their pay docked for any number of reasons, and typically their employer provided them housing and food and clothing, and then deducted the cost of all that from their pay. Contracted laborers who ran away could be hauled back, typically forfeited their back pay, and were sometimes fined and then put to work to pay off those fines. In other cases, labor contracts were used as a punishment for people accused of crimes, essentially recreating slavery under another name. And black codes imposed other limitations. Although the freedmen could now legally marry and could enjoy some rights, they could not vote, they could not serve on juries. In some places, they could not own land or even rent or lease it. In particular, many places made it very difficult for blacks to purchase or even rent land in town, wanting to make sure they stayed in rural areas where they would be forced to keep working on the farms. Black people could be punished for idleness and vagrancy. Essentially, being unemployed was illegal, the punishment for which was typically being forced into a labor contract. The assumption being black people were lazy and wouldn't work unless they were forced to. In fact, most wanted to do honest work if they could. But the problem was finding work that treated them any better than slaves. Eventually, the U.S. government would force an end to these black codes, at least in theory and at most temporarily. But there were no easy solutions to the economic disadvantages of black people. Again, with no capital of their own, they had nothing to offer but their labor. And of course, white landowners typically had nothing to offer but land, having no money to pay workers in any case. So that many black farmers, and eventually many white farmers too, became sharecroppers, working on the old plantations, maybe not their own old plantation, but some plantation, technically renting the land, But with no money to pay rent in most cases, they paid rent with a share of the crop they produced, and were typically told what crop they had to grow, keeping most of them producing the same staple crops, such as cotton, that they had grown in the days of slavery. There were some who did pay in cash and were known as tenant farmers, and this was viewed as being slightly classier than being a sharecropper, but only slightly. And they still had to raise cash crops to sell to pay off their cash rent each year. And so they and many farmers typically ended up in a cycle of debt. As at the beginning of the year, they would have to borrow money to buy seeds, maybe to buy fertilizer or farm equipment. Throughout the year, they might have to borrow money to buy clothing or to buy food, and as many were growing cotton and not food for their own families. They might have to buy other things through the year. But the man on whose land they worked would often lend them money, also keeping them trapped in debt to him. Or local merchants or bankers would lend them money, sell them things on credit. At the end of the year, when the crops were sold, they could then pay off those debts, but then they would have no money, and the next year would have to borrow all over again, keeping many poor farmers trapped in a cycle of debt. This was particularly true of the sharecroppers and tenant farmers of the South, but it was increasingly a problem for farmers of many classes in all parts of the country. In keeping poor farmers, especially black, but sometimes white as well, in something very close to slavery. And Northerners asked if these black codes were what they had fought for since Antietam. Congressional Republicans certainly felt they were not. So when Congress finally reconvened on December 4th, 1865, following a 9-month recess, Republicans were shocked to see many Southern Democrats back in town, having been returned to Congress under Johnson's plan of presidential reconstruction. Indeed, many of these Southern Democrats were former Confederates, generals in the Confederate Army, cabinet officials, even former Vice President Alexander Stevens, who was still under indictment for treason, but now, too, was in the U.S. Congress. Indeed, quite a few are still in the U.S. Congress, their statues standing in Statuary Hall today. And this offended many Republicans on a moral basis that men they had been fighting against over the issue of slavery were now their equals in Congress, but it shocked them politically, too. After all, the Republicans had liked being in charge. During the war, they had passed pretty nearly the whole Republican program, passing the Homestead Act, making Western land very cheap to settle, for free soil farmers getting 160 acres of land each. The Pacific Railroad Act had subsidized a transcontinental railroad under construction at the moment. The Morrill Land Grant Act, Senator Congressman Justin Morrill, allowed states to sell federal lands within their borders and spend the money to set up state universities, the land grant colleges, found in many parts of the United States. And later there were expansions to this law, allowing some states without federal lands in their borders some access to federal land money too. And so Republicans in Congress did not want to lose power to a bunch of traitorous rebel Democrats. And so they refused to let their new colleagues take their seats in the House and Senate. And they knew the problem was only going to get worse, too. Because, of course, under the old three-fifths compromise, slaves in the South had just counted as three-fifths of a person for the purpose of calculating representation. But now that slavery was over, each of those slaves was 5/5 of a person, at least in terms of calculating representation. And so the South was about to get 12 more seats in the House of Representatives. Too many rebels, too many Democrats to contemplate. Who knows what they might do to the Republican platform? They might reverse the Homestead Act. They might stop construction on the Transcontinental Railroad. They might lower the tariff. they might refuse to pay off the national debt. Indeed, there were quite a few people who wanted to repudiate the national debt because it did seem enormously high. And in the short run, that might have been good for the country, but in the long run, it would have destroyed the country's credit, destroyed the trust of foreigners, making it almost impossible for the United States to borrow money again anytime soon, and it would have upset the entire international economy. So Congress refused again to seat these incoming Southern congressmen, infuriating President Johnson. He felt he was restoring the Union more or less as Lincoln had wanted it done, with malice towards none, with charity for all. Although he had plenty of malice of his own. Angry at Congress's response to his form of Reconstruction, he attacked theirs. When Congress passed a bill to extend the duration of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, Johnson vetoed it. In response, Congress passed a civil rights bill, granting black people the rights of citizenship and attacking the black codes. Johnson vetoed that too, but Congress then overturned that veto, as Republicans had more than the 2/3 majority necessary to override a presidential veto. And they would begin doing this repeatedly. Johnson tried to veto so many laws. Some called him Andy Veto, Sir Veto, or because so many of his vetoes were overturned, they called him the dead dog of the White House. And seeing their power, Republicans in Congress now took the Civil Rights Bill and put it in the Constitution itself as the 14th Amendment, conferring civil rights, including citizenship, although not the guaranteed right to vote, on freedmen, indeed people of all races or nations of origin, as long as they were born within the United States, even if they were born a slave. It reduced representation of states in Congress and the Electoral College if they denied blacks the right to vote. It disqualified former Confederates who had earlier held federal offices from holding federal offices again, and guaranteed the national debt while repudiating the Confederate debt. So Congress is doing quite a bit at this time. And under the Congressional Reconstruction that followed in 1866 and 1877, at first Lincoln's 10% plan applied, with the additional requirement that all states ratify the 14th Amendment before returning to the Union. And Tennessee did so, the last state to leave the Union. It became the first state to return. But Johnson encouraged other Southern states to resist this plan, to refuse to ratify the 14th Amendment, and they did so. To try to stop the 14th Amendment from passing and hoping to support fellow Democrats in the congressional elections of 1866, Johnson went on a campaign around the country, what he called the Swing Round the Circle. This was officially a trip to attend the dedication of Stephen Douglas's tomb in Chicago, and it was really a speaking tour, and it was a spectacular failure. Although Johnson could be a good stump speaker, and he spoke passionately against the Republicans in Congress, even accusing them of starting the recent race riots in Memphis, he was pretty easily irritated, and Republicans planted people in the audience to heckle him. As they gave him a hard time, his responses got increasingly wild and frenzied. People began to accuse him of public drunkenness. And ultimately, all he did was alienate voters from himself and his party. And following the elections of 1866, radical Republicans returned to Congress with an even larger majority than before. The radicals in the Senate were led by Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, finally recovered from his terrible beating 10 years before, and an outspoken supporter of black freedom and equality. The most powerful radical in the House of Representatives, Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, was even more devoted to the rights of African Americans. He even asked to be buried in an integrated cemetery at his death. And both of them, Stevens in particular, were deeply vindictive toward the South, for the cruelties done to Southern blacks for centuries, for the death toll of the war and the murder of Lincoln. Among other things, Thaddeus Stevens would be the leader of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. And the radicals wanted to keep the Southern states out of the Union as long as possible, because as long as they're not quite states, the North can enforce drastic social and economic change on the South. Indeed, to hopefully completely reconstruct Southern society. Although moderate Republicans did not think that the people, even Northerners, would support so much radical change. They were willing to coerce state governments, but not individuals. Among other things, they were not particularly willing to seize the property of individual Southerners for redistribution. Still, Republicans, whether radical or moderate, agreed black people needed the right to vote in the South, and were willing to use force to ensure this. So on March 2nd, 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which, along with other later acts, abolished all the Southern states, except Tennessee, which had already ratified the 14th Amendment, saying no states had forfeited their rights to be states when they seceded. Those former states were divided up into 5 military districts, made up of usually 2, but sometimes 1 or 3 former Confederate states. Each had a military governor with 20,000 troops to occupy his district. Tennessee may have avoided military reconstruction, but still didn't get off easy. The governor, William Brownlow, known as Parson Brownlow, from his other career as a Methodist minister, he had yet another career as a newspaper editor. Parson Brownlow used the state militia, or a portion of it called the Home Guard under his control, to enforce his own rule, which was somewhat sympathetic to black Tennesseans, very strongly against the old Confederates, although eventually tainted by corruption and debt as well. But at one point he even had the Home Guard fire their rifles at state legislators within the state capitol, all of whom, as far as I know, managed to dodge. Under military reconstruction, the Southern states were required to ratify the 14th Amendment and to give black men the right to vote. This was not yet required at the national level, but states could decide whom to vote, and again Congress said Southern states under military reconstruction had to let black men vote. Many white people in turn lost the right to vote, at least temporarily, as punishment for their support for the Confederacy. Although the Reconstruction Act did not do what some radicals and black leaders had hoped, it did not offer free education. It gave nobody 40 acres or a mule. The plan was to create friendly state governments and new state constitutions that would eventually let Congress and the Army pull out. Still, the radicals were afraid that once they did leave the South, the old black codes would return again. And so, 1 year after the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, Congress wrote another amendment, which would become the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870. This made it illegal to deny anyone the franchise on the basis of race or former condition of servitude. You could still deny it based on sex or other considerations, but you could no longer keep someone from voting based on race, although somehow this did not apply to Indians. And this was ratified in 1870 by Republicans freely elected in the North and elected under military rule in the South. Now, in creating essentially a military dictatorship in the South, the North the Congress was on somewhat shaky ground legally. The courts had already determined that military courts could not try civilians any time civil courts were available, which had come up in the case of Parte Milligan, settled in 1866. Landon P. Milligan was an Indiana copperhead who belonged to a group that calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, who supported the secession of the West from the Union, planned an armed uprising in Indiana, plotted to attack prisons holding Confederate prisoners of war and free them, and even asked the Confederacy for help. which pushed this conspiracy over the line into treason. Milligan and 4 others were arrested, tried by a military court, and sentenced to death in 1864. But in Ex Parte Milligan, the Supreme Court ruled that the military could not try civilians, even during wartime, if civil courts were open. So Milligan and his friends were freed. But in general, the Supreme Court was kind of scared of the radicals, and frankly, some of their members, including Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, were rather radical themselves. And so, for the most part, they did nothing to oppose military reconstruction. Although there were some Americans who were disappointed by the 14th and 15th Amendment. Before the war, many women who supported civil rights had mostly fought for black rights, saying they could get their own rights later, that being a slave was even worse than being a woman. But when the new amendments were created, women's leaders, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, said these new amendments should also include provisions forbidding the restriction of civil rights or suffrage based on sex. However, the 14th Amendment specifically gave civil rights to men. The 15th Amendment did not mention sex, so it could still be used as a basis to limit the right to vote, and it was. Although the women's movement complained, they did not give up, and would work until they did get the right to vote nationwide 50 years later. So the conflict between Northern plans for Reconstruction and the society that Southerners were used to would result in violence against those whom Southerners saw as a threat, making Reconstruction one of the most unpleasant chapters in the history of the United States. And the debate between Johnson and Congress would lead to the first presidential impeachment in American history.